Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And my friend Aaron, you're up this week.
Correct.
What are you bringing to the table today?
I am bringing another article from the Forges series about corporate power. This one is called How We Beat Corporate Power Before. And it's a conversation between Adem Sengal, who works for Liberation in a Generation, and he's interviewing Knox, who works for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which fights monopolies and the concentration of corporate power, and Candace Milner, who works for Demos, which is working to build a just, inclusive, multiracial democracy and economy. Mm-hmm. And this conversation helps define corporate power and monopolies, dives into the history of how people have resisted corporate power in the past, what people are doing now to oppose corporations, the importance of policy organizations being in partnership with grassroots organizations, and the challenges of navigating the current economy while trying to oppose corporate power and monopolies, and all of the pitfalls and traps that there are in the economy as it exists right now.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of great stuff in here, and why don't we just jump in? Where do you want to start?
Yeah. Well, it's awesome to get back to this incredible series in the Forge and their collaboration with Liberation in a Generation. So thanks for bringing it back to the table for us. This was another great piece in the series, and specifically, I felt this was a great conversation about the history and present day impact of corporate power and monopoly power. And as you say, all the organizing work to fight against it.
Yep.
And one of the things I appreciated early on in this piece was their conversation about what is corporate power and what is monopoly power, which I thought was great. And I especially appreciated Ron talking about who has power and who does not have power, because that's an important and connected part of all of this. And his examples I thought were really instructive as well. So Ron says this in response to that specific question, quote, "The main thing that these monopolistic companies want to do is extract. These are extractive corporations. They want to extract your labor. They want to extract wealth. They want to extract your resources. That's their whole goal. And they don't make these supersized profits any other way. So they tend to target communities that they think have the least amount of power to fight back against that extraction. So for example, where are the big tech data centers located? Today, there are over 1,200 data centers that are sited in the American South. And they're often built in or nearby Black communities where they extract enormous amounts of power and water, and they're driving electricity bills sky high. And these companies assume that they'll just face no consequences because these communities don't have the political power to stop them. I also think about dollar stores. They're really the same in a lot of ways. They come into a community, they extract wealth, they put local grocers out of business, and in return, what do? They just deliver this unhealthy food at sometimes way higher per ounce prices than you would find even at just regular grocer. So that's how I think about that power balance. The good news, of course, is that this power dynamic is really shifting at the moment. And I don't know, it was that extractive part and nature of corporate power in his explanation here that really got me. The greed and the lack of care for the health, the money, the well-being of people and communities is so telling of why these monopolies and corporations need to be checked. And I so appreciated getting back to the idea of like the data centers, because we've talked about that before, and where they get located and sited, as Ron said here. But it's just having such a negative impact on these communities.
Yeah, and I really appreciated how they opened with this conversation about the different perspectives they have on corporate power and monopoly power and what that is and how it impacts people. And I really love that connection that Ron makes between the extractive ways that data centers operate and dollar stores operate. And you can add into that Walmart and other big box stores that come in and they wipe out local shops,
businesses, mom and pop stores.
Those independent places that you could go before are now mostly gone because these monopolistic companies came in and drove out the competition, which were small businesses. And so that's That's an element that I think I appreciate him drawing that parallel between how data centers are working and the view that we have of that and the sort of collective negativity that we have around data centers
Yes.
right now, and tying it back to this pattern of economic behavior and control that has happened from these giant corporations for decades.
Yeah.
I think it was a big conversation I remember hearing as a kid in the 90s around Walmarts and different big box stores like that.
Absolutely.
So Candace continues this in her answer about extractive corporate power right after that quote from Ron that you just shared.
Right.
So she says, quote, I also think about how they control the decisions we make. If you live in a town where you don't have many grocery stores and your only option is one grocery store, Walmart, you don't get to participate in boycotts in the same way because you don't have those options, because corporate power and monopolies have taken that from you. So I think about how they have control and how they create or take away options from everyday people. We see this in elections. We see this in policy decisions where elected officials who depend on corporate donations to run their campaigns and are at the will of these really powerful corporate lobbyists aren't making decisions for the people, but instead for these donors who have shown this outsized problem. And, you know, we talk a lot about freedom in this country.
Yeah.
And most of it just means freedom to participate in an economy that is stacked against you.
Ooh.
And Candace is highlighting how we don't even always have the freedom to choose how we participate.
Yeah.
If the only options that we have that make any logistical sense for us are companies we're supposed to be boycotting or are in direct opposition to our values, then what do we do?
Right.
We're stuck because the way that those huge corporations have positioned themselves to be the only game in town changes what is even available to us, as we talked about
Absolutely.
earlier with the way that dollar stores and Walmarts and what have you have positioned themselves to knock out any competition in small towns.
Absolutely. If that's the only place that you
Yeah.
can get the goods and the food and the things that you need to survive, it changes how we're able to interact with them and to oppose them or to advocate for our comrades to have better wages working at those places.
Yep.
All the things, right? It's all impacted. That's such an incredible point that she makes here. One of the other parts of their conversation that I found really fascinating and important in this discussion of corporate and monopoly power came from Candace and her insights on the role that commercial banking has played and how particularly people of color have been excluded and discriminated against and exploited in our capitalist society throughout history. And she offers so many concrete examples of this. I'm only going to share part of this quote, and it's still kind of long, but it's so great. She says, quote, Black households have $15 in wealth for every $100 held by white households. And if current trends in wealth accumulation hold up, it would take nearly 8 centuries for Black households to amass the same level of wealth as white households. I start with this because I think it really grounds us into understanding the power that banks have to multiply money, and that being their key role. Over the years, banks have been used as a tool to consistently build wealth for the few while extracting it from Black and brown communities. We see it with slavery, with banks investing in the buying and selling of Black folks in the South who were enslaved. We see it throughout American history. We see that it is harder for Black and brown folks to access loans for businesses than it is for white folks, even at different income levels. Post-war, when there were a lot of pushes for home ownership, we started to see redlining. Black and brown communities were deemed as being risky investments. So banks were denying loans to folks in those communities, or the loan terms they got were very expensive, incredibly unfair, and had really bad terms. That directly correlated to Black and brown neighborhoods being undervalued and the homes in those neighborhoods being undervalued. So even when Black and brown communities were able to get a home to start to accumulate wealth in this particular way, it wasn't at the same rate as their white counterparts. We've also seen that in the 80s, when banks started to consolidate, the huge loss of community banking that we continue to see today. Many Black and brown neighborhoods do not have access to physical banking branches and locations, so that means their only option for banking is a big corporation that they could bank through virtually or online. Also, those branches in a lot of places got replaced by payday loan centers.
Yep.
So now, in order to access your paycheck, you're getting almost taxed a second time, but this time not even by the government, just by a corporation who's stealing from you because you don't have access to banks.
Yeah.
Gold. And again, I'm stopping there. She says so many more things and offers so many more examples in the piece. She talks about subprime loans that contributed to the 2008 recession, and also about this incredible concept about how modern banks don't give back to communities that they serve in the same ways that they used to, like in the same meaningful, real ways that they used to. And so this idea of the role that banks have played and contributed to the conditions that people find themselves in is just huge. And it connects to, your thought around Walmart, these big corporations just extracting from folks.
Yeah, and they make this connection between banks and financing and enslavement and how much that all was really financed by banks. Mm-hmm. And I mean, even Wall Street, where most of we think about banking happening in this country, is a former slave market. And that's what it initially was. And the wall that it's named after was built by enslaved people.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of foundations in how even finance operates in this country that is grounded in enslavement, and we don't talk about it. But all of that is tied into these huge modern day banks.
Yes.
That, to fast forward to 2008, they were too big to fail.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we had to bail them out. And who is we? The taxpayer.
Yeah.
All of the rest of us had to bail out their terrible choices that they were making to exploit us.
Right.
And so
crazy.
Yeah. There's just so much infuriating choices that happen, and we don't get a choice in
we have
how
no
we
say in that and participate. Yeah, absolutely.
So, banks have contributed so much to our current state of affairs and where we find ourselves in. And just to think about Trump and the giant banks that have bankrolled him over the years based on very little, is a huge piece of where we're at and why he is where he is. And so she mentions at the end there how disconnected banks are from our communities.
Right.
And then their conversation shifts into the context of what people are facing right now. And so Ron says, quote, "Our immigrant siblings are getting kidnapped off the streets. LGBTQ rights are getting rolled back. Women's rights are under attack. All these things are important, and all these things have to be addressed. But meanwhile, we have policymakers that come from this world of extraction. They come from big tech. They come from private equity and what have you. And they're trying to shove this new kind of monopoly power down our throats and push it into our communities. So we have to stay vigilant against that. We have to stay informed. We have to stay educated. And more than anything, we have to get and stay organized, whether that's in your workplace, whether that's among your fellow small business owners, whether that's in your neighborhood, in your community. We're stronger together. I know it's such a simple thing to say, and it's an idea that comes so naturally to people, but it's so important to live it and to breathe in it, right? We are stronger together, and it's true now more than ever before. And there is good news. We can see organized people and communities across the country who are really fighting back and who are scoring wins everywhere, from the urban core, places in rural America, and everywhere in between. We're seeing all kinds of important wins and pushbacks against corporate power, and it all comes from these three things: understanding what the problem is, identifying it, and knowing how to push back. And you push back through being organized and standing together.
I love that.
Yeah, and this is such a big takeaway from so much of what we read on this show.
Yeah.
Whether that's Miriam Kaba or Dean Spade last week, or Robin D.G. Kelly, when people develop relationships and they get organized into some kind of formation, they can actually change the conditions that they know exist.
Right.
And we're seeing this now with how people are responding differently to mass surveillance through Flock or Axum cameras, and the data centers that we've already mentioned and how extractive they are on all of our utility bills.
Yeah.
And so it's a thing that we're seeing people say, wait a minute, this isn't it. And so I appreciate Ron's analysis here and saying we're seeing this happen and we're seeing more people stand up to this.
Well, I appreciate you so much for always bringing us back to some of the things, the incredible things that we read and talk about in this podcast. So bringing up Miriam Kaba and Dean Spade and Dr. Kelly, I mean, kudos to you for doing that, because it's building our armor around calling this out for what it is. And what I really appreciate about Ron, what the quote that you shared there was, he said, this is simple stuff, right? We know this, but it has to continue to be said. Like we have to, as he said, like live and breathe it, right? And the way that we can live and breathe it is we hear it time and time again, and we learn more about it and understand additional context around it.
Well, and it's one of those things that's easier said than done.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
There's that too, where it's easy to see what a problem is. It's harder to know what to do with that problem once you see it. And so I think that that's another piece of it, is to hear it over and over again. I think, as you said, helps build your armor. It helps fortify you into getting into some kind of resistance to that corporate power.
That's great. The other thing that stood out to me as an important takeaway, speaking of takeaways from this conversation, was what they shared about the resiliency and organizing response from people and communities of color, from immigrants, from farmers throughout history in this fight for economic justice. And I wanted to highlight some of Candace's insights because, they connect to what we talked about last week with Dean Spade's book. She says, quote, I think about the history of mutual aid, especially in Black communities. And like you said, it dates back to slavery. When you read a lot of the history of Galveston and the communities that the celebration of Juneteenth came out of, there are so many instances of mutual aid for things like burial. Another part of this is the resiliency and culture, right? A lot of the Black tradition of soul food or even Cajun food. When we think about New Orleans or Geechee food, when we think about South Carolina, a lot of that also came from this resiliency of being excluded, given the scraps, but being so creative and so determined that something great and beautiful came out of it. And those traditions traveled. The mutual aid that we've seen enslaved folks come up with, you see it in the North in Reconstruction, where the folks who owned those businesses on those Black Wall Streets and Black Main Streets also pooled their money to be able to cover burials, to be able to give resources to widows and orphans in their communities, to help people when they were unemployed. It was these things that lived on. And then when thinking about that specific resistance, you have to talk about SNCC and the sit-ins and lunch counters. And while those lunch counters were family owned and small businesses, when you're having sit-ins that are organized across states, they don't get to monopolize who can eat lunch at a counter anymore because you're all getting boycotted. When you think about the Montgomery bus boycott, those folks don't have cars, but when they are committed to say, we are going to boycott, that is a very clear example of fighting against a concentrated power. And in the West Coast, Chicano farmers, the way they organized and unionized and how it led to farmers having the right to organize in California was huge. The Black Panther Party, their free breakfast program, is the reason that kids have access to free lunch today across the country, regardless of race. They had clinics, they had legal aid, and these are all things that exist as a general public good in so many places today. So I think it's really important to think about how these fights against corporate power lead us to reimagining what public goods should look like.
Yeah.
Man, all of that is so awesome. And Candace's points about how these fights led to the reimagining of what public goods should look like, and also how mutual aid can be and is so important to us as people and to our communities, are just powerful thoughts.
Yeah, and I think about the way, too, that some of those things that she names are even, they're powerful changes that happened in the country. And the reason why they exist is actually controlled opposition. So free breakfast for kids is because the government wanted to take that power away from the Black Panther Party.
Right.
To actually be able to serve their community effectively.
Right.
And to say, well, we're all doing it.
Yeah.
And undermining it. So there's a way too that this, as she calls it, aptly, I think, Black mutual aid is undermined through a history of white supremacy in this country that then says, whoa, we could do this. You think about the way that public education exists. We talked about that a few weeks ago.
Yes.
Public education exists because in Reconstruction, Black people were like, we need education.
Absolutely. Education is powerful, is important, it's necessary.
And so now it exists. And is there's ways that is also controlling the opposition from the state. And so it's interesting that these things are powerful examples of how we're rethinking public goods. And sometimes there's also that convergence of interests from the state to say, well, now we can also undermine these projects. So I was just thinking about that, especially in the context of last week's mutual aid conversation and that book, and the way that the Black Panther Party was undermined because of that free breakfast program.
Absolutely.
So
that's a good point.
Anyway, tying all of that together, let's talk about application.
Let's do it.
How do we apply this article to our day-to-day lives and work? My application comes from something Candace says in the context of how she works at Demos to partner between the policymaking and grassroots organizations. So she says, quote, I really think it's important to not only have those grassroots folks, so you have a clear picture when you're going into that solution-making mindset, but also because we know that we need a lot of different experts to make things happen. We have to respect the expertise of organizers because the expertise they bring is an expert of people. And if we really want to impact people and make people's lives better, they have to be in the room.
Yes.
And then Ron goes on to say, meanwhile, in people's backyards, on their main streets, and their communities, they're engaged in hand-to-hand combat with some of the worst corporate actors on the planet. And they're really doing it. And I think that's important because I think the managerial class, the managerial folks, the people in institutions, the people in government are getting further and further removed from the struggles and experiences of working class people. And that's been going on for a long time. And if anything is actually going to be addressed, we have to see strong partnerships between grassroots, working class organizations, and that sort of middle class, managerial class policy folks who are trying to make a difference. There has to be a real connection, a real relationship with that.
Absolutely.
Similar to what Ron said earlier about how we're all in this together.
Yes.
And we're stronger together. And so that strength has to come together across a lot of different lines.
Absolutely. And we all have to understand our place in that and bring our expertise together to make something better, to reimagine a different world. So I love that. My application comes from something that Candace actually says early on in this conversation about what Demos is doing, because I thought it was particularly poignant and powerful. And it connects a little bit to what I shared earlier too. So it's a simple thing that she says. She says, quote, at Demos, we talk about building power a lot because we do also believe in people power. We believe that when people work together, when communities work together, history shows us, and even current times show us, that they can counter this corporate power and they can have really meaningful wins in their communities. I don't know. I just thought that was a really inspiring statement, and their conversation in this piece and the examples that they shared around how people have shown up time and time again to resist and to organize and to fight is amazing. And it's just a model for how we need to continue to show up moving forward. And I think it connects to your application as well, and how we work with, grassroots organizers and organizations and the like as well. Yeah,
absolutely. That's great. I highlighted that part too, when she's talking about Demos and their power building perspective. I think that's great.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk a little about homework.
Okay.
What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work beyond our conversation today? My homework is to continue this series from The Forge.
Oh, yeah.
The next one in this series talks about fights for public banking and broadband infrastructure. And, the impact of banking came up in this article, and we talked about that quite a bit.
Yeah.
But we didn't talk much about broadband. It wasn't a part of their conversation, but that's a huge way that it doesn't feel like we have a choice in our communities.
Yeah.
Either the infrastructure doesn't exist at all, like in rural communities, or you get one or two choices, which are both giant mega conglomerates that own a lot of stuff and are terrible for people. So, it'd be great to read that conversation and follow this series and continue it. So that's my homework. What about you?
Yeah, this is the piece that connects directly to, right? It's another conversation between Adem and two other experts in this work. Oh, yeah, we should definitely check that out. I want to do some work to check out the organizations that Ron and Candace work at. So as you mentioned, Ron works with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, this policy and advocacy organization that's working with equitable local communities to fight monopoly power and corporate concentration. And then Candace works with Demos, this nonprofit public policy org that's doing the work to build a just, inclusive, and multiracial democracy and economy. And so it would be cool to dig into both of those organizations and learn more about their work and how they've supported and their communities and the fight for economic justice. I think on their websites they have their case studies and their victories and all of that. So I just want to read more about that.
Cool.
Two things are mentioned in this piece that both Ron and Candace contributed to that I'd also like to check out. So Ron recently wrote a zine about the modern fight against corporate and monopoly power. And Candace shares a bit of the insights from a report that Demos and the New Economy Project published last year. And it's called Public Banks for Racial Equity, Democratizing Finance to Build Community Wealth. And so I think checking out that report and checking out Ron's zine would just continue to allow us to learn more about this work. And so I'd love to do that.
Yeah, those were both things that I highlighted as possible things to follow up on in the future.
I love it.
All right. Well, that's it for our conversation today about this great conversation on how we beat corporate power before. And Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yeah, well, you brought us back to this great series in the Forge today. I want to bring us back to the new issue of Hammer and Hope, if that sounds good to you.
Sounds great.
So for next week, again, it's always hard to choose an article from Hammer and Hope, but I'm going to bring a piece called "The Supreme Court Blesses the Destruction of Black Electoral Power," which was written by Vincent M. Sutherland. And the tagline of this piece is, quote, "The court's conservative supermajority has gutted what remained of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Yep.
And that is a simple statement, but a powerful statement, true statement. It has been so upsetting to witness the decisions of this Supreme Court and make sense of the impact of those decisions. But I'm looking forward to reading this piece because I feel like Hammer and Hope always allows us to dig into these kinds of issues, especially the ones that hurt, and have a good conversation about it. And I always love having these conversations with you. So I'm looking forward to doing that next week.
Yeah, I think that I didn't know that they could gut more of the Voting Rights Act than they already did however many years ago that was.
Right.
And they found a way to do it.
Surprise, they did.
Yeah.
Go.
So I appreciate the opportunity to learn more about how they did gut that because,
we have to know it, and then we have to figure out what
you can't
comes
face
next.
a problem until you know it.
There it is. Very good.
Not that I know how to face this problem in particular, but, it's something to face.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, so with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.